Philosophers talk to our times, towards a theory of common notions. One of the things about Spinoza is he's bamboozling. He's not difficult, he just bamboozles. One of the problems, you see, is that he will use the same word, different words, for things that he clearly means are the same. But are they the same? And how you understand that really defines how you relate to Spinoza. And different interpreters suppress different complexities in the words, or augment them. Let me try and explain that a bit, unpick that. What really got me going was yesterday I was reading somebody and they were getting terribly upset, frustrated. They couldn't tell anymore whether the mode and the affection were sometimes the same and sometimes different. Because they were reading a lousy translation. They were reading the Ewell translation. Never read the Ewell translation. If your knowledge of Spinoza is based on Ewell, forget everything you've ever known and go and buy a proper translation. Go and buy either Curley's translation, which is the one you ought to all have, because it is the one translation that keeps all the textured Latin. So it does a literal translation. It always translates affectus as one thing, affection as one thing. It means the grammar gets tied in knots and sometimes it's almost incomprehensible. Well, until about the 12th or 50th reading anyway. Because he sacrifices clarity for accuracy on the terminology. And then if you want a much more readable version, go off and get the Shirley version. Indeed, you can get the complete versions of Spinoza in the Shirley version, which is wonderful. It's one of my go-to texts when I'm still rereading Spinoza, because it's relatively straightforward. Or there's an edition by Parkinson, G.H. Parkinson, who does a lovely translation of Spinoza. There might be, all my translations are 20 years old. There might be some even more wonderful ones. But G.H. Parkinson was good, and he also re-edits the much earlier and very poetic Boyle's translation, which is inaccurate, but poetical and so beautiful. My point is here then, that you are reading a complicated language. Spinoza writes in complex Latin, and it's made all the worse because you're never really sure what language he wants to have written in. He spoke about six of them. And there is a theory sometimes that it was written in Dutch first and then translated into Latin, which may be true. I don't know. I never really believed it myself, actually, if I'm honest with you, because I was never sure. I was convinced I knew what language Spinoza thought in. Although I suppose he wrote in Dutch, but never mind. So you have that entire problem of the texture of the Latin and also the problem of translation. And it happens again and again and again. The simplest, easiest example is the one that often gets misquoted, actually. And that's because Spinoza uses the word sieve, which sometimes gets translated as or, but really is that is. He will say substance, that is God, that is nature. I don't think he ever says all three of them all together. Book 1 certainly will say God, that is substance. God, though, isn't quite the same as substance. Substance is kind of the abstract form. But once he's concluded that God is in the absolute middle, once he's concluded that substance must be an absolute middle, he tends to call it God. So that they are synonymous, but there's a move in the terminology. Or again, there's that very famous statement, Proposition 4, Book 4, where he talks of God or nature, and using sieve. And therefore you get the very strong impression that Spinoza thinks that nature and God are one and the same, which is the thing that most people know about him. Yeah, kinda. He says it in one proposition, and he uses sieve. And I tend to understand sieve as unique for that proposition. After all, that's the way I use that is. If I say something, that is something, I'm meaning it in terms of my argument I am making. And that tends to be the way I think Spinoza uses sieve. But there you go, I've interpreted him in the light of what I want to say. Because it doesn't fit within my particular interpretation of the absolute middle. Because the absolute middle is the driving force. It's the naturan naturans. It's the making of nature. It is that into which nature falls. The being caught up of ecosystems that define it as a system, rather than just God. So I would always interpret civ as this proposition, this moment, these are the same. But that's kind of the problems that are easy to debate. Then you get on to the really complicated ones. And the really complicated ones are the seen and the hidden. Let me do the scene first. One of the things that will make your head explode or drive you with the temptation to bang it against the wall, I think I did that, which kind of helped, but then I got epilepsy, is Spinoza's use of the word essence. Now, first of all, a quick word about essence. You can have endless fun with essence. The word essende is quite close to the word being. And one of the projects I used to do was to have a copy of Spinoza on the computer where I swapped essence for being. And if you do that, my God, he sounds like Heidegger. It's worth doing if you've never done it. It kind of changes how you understand he could be. Now, I don't believe that essence is being, but it's interesting. But that's a total beside the point. That's another little ferret I've just put down the rabbit hole. But the trouble is with the essence is that you lose track, I think there's at least 7 or 8, of things that he calls the essence of man. Whether it is the conatas, the desire, power, the capacity to act. I've missed out one. The essence of a mind is a body that actually exists. Okay, and they're all called the essence of man. And at least kind of superficially, they're radically different. And you're going, what? Another one? Until you want to just give up. And at that point, you've got various stratagems. The 2 normal stratagems at that point would be either to use the stratagem that Jonathan Bennett does in his book Spinoza, or Spinozaism, I think it is, which is he discovers a genealogy, I suppose, in the writing of ethics. After all, ethics was originally 3 books, and it did this and it did that, and it had a history. And so you can easily just say, well, some of them belong to earlier Spinoza, some of them belong to late Spinoza, and they don't quite work together. It's a perfectly legitimate move. I have problems with Bennett's interpretation because I think he imports an analytical philosopher inside Spinoza and does it brutally. But about that, he could well be true. It's just I find it philosophically very unsatisfying. Because the minute you start inventing chronologies and say, well, this he wrote then and that he wrote then what am I going to do? Am I going to say the moon is made of green cheese as well? I've gone beyond the text. I've appealed to a legend of an author. And for me, that's against the rules. I don't do that with texts. I let them stand alone, independent of the genealogy of the author. Now, you can say that's crap, if you like. I don't mind. It's just my philosophical prejudices coming out. Or alternatively, faced with the welter of terminology that is so complicated that you would give up any possibility of having your own thoughts to understand it, you just simply break with Spinoza and interpret him in terms of how you want to interpret him. This was the move that Leibniz makes. It's a very great move because it is very easy, if you concentrate on certain bits of Spinoza, to turn it into a wonderful, wonderful counterweight. And there is a sense in which Leibniz spends his life arguing against his version of Spinoza. A version he writes down in a sequence of questions, furious arguments, counter-arguments after their meeting when Spinoza was a young man. And in the last year of when Leibniz was a young man and Spinoza was in the last years of his life. However, it is, and you can see, by the way, how much Leibniz is occupied by Spinoza, because much, much later in life, he goes back to Spinoza and writes almost a defense of him when he's reading somebody else who's critiqued him. So he's always thinking about him. He's always there in the backdrop, but he's always misrepresenting him. He's always twisting him according to how he wanted to understand him, which was in terms of the fallacy of the attributes. That Spinoza has to be wrong because substance, there ought to be an infinite number of minds within the one attribute, which is the attribute of thought. And so it just doesn't work. It's logically inaccurate, but he's onto something. Okay, I think he says somewhere, if it wasn't for the monad, Spinoza would be right. But he doesn't even think that. But it is philosophically absolutely engaging. And I argue, I have argued elsewhere, but not on YouTube and in books, that You have to understand Leibniz. One of the ways to understand Deleuze, for me, by far the best way to understand Deleuze, is that his Spinoza is the one that Leibniz is writing about. It's not Spinoza. It's nothing to do with Spinoza, but it's the Leibnizian Spinoza. And so he imports Leibniz into Spinoza, Leibniz into Spinoza, or more realistically, he imports the Leibnizian concept of Spinoza into Spinoza. And that gives him the space to talk about Bergson, which I talked about a bit yesterday. But the Bergson relationship is not the important one. The important relationship there is between Spinoza and Leibniz. As a moment in Spinoza scholarship, I actually have one more thing I need to get back to talking about Spinoza's terminology, but I think I'll do this here, okay, because I haven't got a good place to do it, and I'm all set up now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Deleuze, and then we'll come back to the things that are hidden in Spinoza's technology. So one of the things that Deleuze does is he never ever abandons that relationship between Spinoza and Leibniz. And I actually would argue that it was the driving force, the way he wants to for his philosophy, or if not the driving force, the thing he always goes back to. So there is a book called the Anti-Oedipus Papers, which was the letters he wrote with Gattiari just as they're beginning to write Anti-Oedipus, so 1970s. So after Expressionism, when he seems to have finished his study of Spinoza, and he's very clearly reading him again. He's reading him again, Leibniz again. And it is from that reading, from that way of thinking, from the questions that Gattiari is asking him about Spinoza and his relationship with Leibniz, that Anti-Oedipus is born. It's one of those fascinating moments in your philosophy where you go, oh, hang on. So Leibniz and Spinoza, the Leibnizian reading of Spinoza was what was driving Deleuze's philosophy. And of course he does it again much later on, in 1988 in The Fold. And 1986, whatever, in The Fold, where he presents yet another account of Leibniz, terribly influenced by Spinoza. And in fact, the entire kind of dualism, I suppose, is the right word for that particular account of Leibniz, where he has an account of the body and the account of the monad in separate things, and gives a wonderful account of the body and attributes it to Leibniz. But that's really Leibniz's reading of Spinoza. And yes, you can find it in Leibniz in a set of letters called the De Bos letters. But the De Bos letters were written counterfactually. They're not serious letters. So Leibniz is writing as if the body existed, not because the body existed. But Deleuze, of course, moves it backwards. He moves it backwards to Spinoza. Now, my point here, going back to Spinoza, I know I've got sidetracked into Deleuze and Spinoza, but they're very linked at this point, is that all through his life, one of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century was misinterpreting Spinoza. And he was doing it because of the sheer complexity of the language. And the sheer complexity of the language means that unless you are going to really bang your head against walls till you give yourself epilepsy, it becomes almost impossible to understand the subtleties of what Spinoza is saying. And that is a real problem when you are reading him. You just simply have to know it. You can take various strategies. You can take the Deleuzean strategy. You can do an Kantian interpretation. You certainly do a Humean reading of Spinoza. It works very well. And simplify your soul and make it easy. Or you can do what I try to do, which is to make my brain bleed and make for instance, the capacity to act and the sense that it is the essence needs to be made into a real thing. Because it challenges how you understand what you are. That's why I have the formula in the middle of itself and the absolute middle and all those middles. They're all ways to understand, to try to capture what that means, what the moves are, what the shifts are. So yes, I too have invented my own scaffolding. But at least it's external to Spinoza. It's literally a scaffolding where I'm running up and down, so I can go into the argument at different points. What I'm not trying to do is to reinterpret the argument. I try to hold that still. Because I think you have to, otherwise I just think you could say anything. It doesn't matter. God made the world could just mean the cock hen entered the peahen's nest, as Martin Luther would say, once you start changing the meaning or dismissing things because they don't work in your interpretation. Anyway, that's simply a problem in Spinoza. That's why, in case you've wondered, why I've been taking so many weeks to go back to him and to common notions, because I knew I'd have to go through all these terminologies. And to be honest with you, I was putting it off. But I haven't finished yet. There's also the things that are blind in the Spinoza, that are hard to see, but that hugely matter. These are little Latin words that he uses. My favourite, or the one I can remember off the top of my head, is invicum. There are others, but invicum is the one that matters most, perhaps. Now, invicum is the way Spinoza defines the relationship between the smallest bodies, relations of motion and rest. This matters because this is how it is both the infinite and mediate mode of the attributes, so it is what follows from the attributes. So it could be translated, if you want to. I know that some people have done it as energy, but it isn't really energy because Spinoza doesn't have a theory of energy. But it's relations of motion of rest caught up. And invicum is how you translate invicum is how you understand them. So are they caught up in each other or with each other, which I think is what Curley says. One another, I think he calls them. Caught up one in another. Or you go back to an earlier translation, Boyle's reciprocally defined relations of motion and rest. It matters because there's slight differences between them, and he uses the word again and again. Invicum is kind of a technical word in Spinoza. It is not entirely clear. Again, just to go back to Deleuze. Deleuze uses that unclarity to import Bergson into Spinoza again. How does he do it? Oh, he turns the invicum relations of motion and rest into infinite clusters of motions of rest, always in infinite numbers, using letter 15 and the idea of very many and turning it into a technical term. So he invents a terminology that imports itself into the lack of clarity of Spinoza's language and allows him to find Bergson in Spinoza. Does the argument work? Well, it works. Yeah, it works. It works. Good Deleuzianism. Good Spinozianism? No, I think Spinoza's saying something else, frankly. I just do. I think his Latin is saying something else. I kept the Latin versions when I was in university. I had the Latin versions on perpetual borrow, so I could always go back and check it. And I just think he's doing something else. But that's neither here nor there. Expressionism remains a wonderful book, and for that matter, Deleuze's misuse of the DeBoss letters remains wonderful, good copy. It's great stuff. It's just not really what you want, not really Spinoza, and that doesn't matter. So what I've been trying to do in this, again, somewhat overly long essay, all these essays on Spinoza are likely to be about 17 to 20 minutes. It's just because I can't do it shorter. What I've been trying to do is to explain why Spinoza is so hard. To explain why you'll read him. And sometimes he feels so easy, you go, oh yes, of course. And sometimes, to be honest with you, he's plodding his way through the definitions of emotions and you say, get a move on, Benedict. And sometimes he's so difficult, all you want to do is run away into a small hole and go, well, I'm not Spinozian, I don't understand. And it's actually because he is using a huge scaffolding of his own. A complicated scaffolding that is picking up textures that are hard to grasp and that you have to really think about. You really have to stand in the beauty of a May morning and think about and understand how the capacity to be affected is in fact just the human essence, is the idea of the body that actually exists. The sense in which they are the same. They only need to be the same once in a certain way, that is. But you have to think that similarity, what it means. Not resolve it into just the power relations you already defined, but think about how Spinoza wants to use the word power. Because that is what it frees you from what otherwise happens in Spinoza. If you like, my philosopher I import into Spinoza is of course Nietzsche. One of the things that it is very easy to do with Spinoza is to keep him very locked down on substance, God and modes. And if you do that, and then everything becomes about quantities of power that a mode has. But that's not what he does. He really doesn't do it because of desire, and desire being the essence of men. It's almost like the essence of a human, as they actually are, shatters across the world, enters into lots of other relationships, lots of other capacities to act. And the human is all those capacities to act, concentrated or unconcentrated, caught up one within the other. Why? Because the human is in the absolute middle of existing. That's why. And that is what it means to be in the middle. It means to have never been finished. There's no simple links between anything. There's no simple thing you are. You are that being caught up within. And you can start to see how it moves. And common notions then are the superstructure that define that absolutely being caught up within. And that is what we'll go back to. I say that. I hate to tell you, those of you who want to follow common notions, Tomorrow I'm probably going to have one more on dystopia because I've got something I've just got to say. I'm just furious about it. So I'll have to do that tomorrow. But we're coming back to common notions and I will stick on them. And if that means we have to do 20 minutes and it takes forever to upload, say la vie. I owe Spinoza that much for a life.